I guess it moves quite nicely to our next speaker, Rade MUSULIN, who is a principal at Affinity Consulting in Sydney, has a vast experience in insurance broking and reinsurance, and currently, like he already mentioned, that he's already the chair of the IA working group. And but however, today instead of talking about climate change, he will be talking about animals today, swans, elephants, butterflies. I'm kidding. He will be talking about historical cat events, large crises, and the response to emerging threats. Rade.
Okay, thank you, Velda. I really appreciate that. And let me just share my screen. Did that come up properly? I hope so. So thank you very much. And before I begin, a few words about my talk. This is the same talk I gave at the Casualty Actuarial Society General Session recently. I am sharing it with you today, and I'm honored to be asked to speak to you. My agenda today is going to cover what you can read on the screen, but verbally, I'm going to use the writings of some very well-known authors to find insights into extreme risk. I will not be putting up a lot of graphs and charts. That was Steve's role. But my objective instead is to offer a teaser to you to induce you, to read further. I'll give examples of major risk management failures, focusing on things inherent in human psychology that lead to these swan events like COVID-19. I'll then use historical examples of major crises to show how systems deal with these discontinuities, such as the current pandemic. And I'll close with some thoughts on adjusting our mindsets to help us manage risk in a world filled with extreme events. Look, in the following slides, there's a lot of concepts, and I will not try to explain them thoroughly. Instead, I'm going to try to offer you a broad sampling of ideas, which you can then explore further if you're interested. I understand that Velda will be distributing a copy of the slide deck to the attendees, and then in here you will see links to various articles for further reading. So my first section is called Catastrophic Complexities, Swans, Elephants, and Butterflies. A black swan, Nassim Taleb is the author of the book, The Black Swan, and I'll refer to him later, but he says there's three attributes of a black swan. It's unpredictable, it has consequences, and you can retroactively explain it. Another brilliant mind that I wanted to quote here is Mao Zedong, who said everything under heaven is in utter chaos and the situation is excellent. That's a picture on the screen of one of my university textbooks. And in fact, I'm an example of chaos. I studied Chinese history at university. I had no idea what an actuary was. And 30 years later, I ended up working in China as an actuary. So it just goes to show you that chaos can be excellent. The first author I want to introduce you to is a gentleman named David Brooks. He's written the book Social Animal, which I found an excellent book. And he's basically tried to relate political thinking, human psychology, and risk. And about a decade ago, he wrote an article called Drilling for Certainty. The link to the article is there if you get the slide deck. And basically, that article covered the Deepwater Horizon oil rig disaster in the Gulf of Mexico, just south of the United States. And it was an excellent example of something that supposedly couldn't happen, and that was a clear risk management failure exacerbated by human psychology. And Brooks observed that humans tend to design systems where little errors lead to big consequences. We allow ourselves to get acclimated to risk. We place too much faith in elaborate backup devices. We match complicated systems with complicated governance. We spread good news and hide bad news, and we are prone to groupthink. And Brooks used the term catastrophic complexity to talk about the collision of human psychology with our highly complex world. And in the later examples of some of the disasters I'm going to show you, I'm going to draw out these points that Brooks made and try to illustrate how those human psychological effects lead to risk management failures. The next authors I want to introduce you to are Nassim Taleb again and Greg Treverton. Taleb wrote the Black Swan book. Treverton wrote the book Truth to Power, talking about the U.S. national security environment and how sometimes you've got to tell powerful people things they don't want to hear. And they wrote an article around 2015 analyzing some recent world events. And they developed something that Taleb has talked about, which is called the theory of fragility. And basically what the theory of fragility basically tries to say is that systems that are not stressed for long periods of time and appear very stable can in fact become very fragile. So their hypothesis was that while actually volatility can signal stability and vice versa. So Italy, which has had like 100 governments since World War II, actually has a fairly stable political system. And also saying that, well, past experience is not a good indicator of tail risk. And so instead of trying to figure out what black swans are in the future, it can be more fruitful to focus on how resilient systems are and how they can handle disorder. And as I said a second ago, their fundamental point was that systems that experience moderate change and disorder become more resilient and vice versa. So the question is, just efforts to create stability sow the seeds for black swans. And they used the example of the Arab Spring. We had a heat wave in Russia. That led to crop failures. That led the price of bread to double in places like Egypt. And people living on $3 a day were spending $2 a day on bread to feed their families. And that led to a political regime in Egypt, which had lasted for 30 years, to fall in 30 days. And their hypothesis is that that was an example of a fragile system because it had suppressed stress for too long. My next animal was an elephant. And that's a concept that was introduced by a guy named Adam Sweden in 2014. And he talks about black elephants. And that's a cross between a black swan, which Taleb talked about, and the proverbial elephant in a room, the problem that's visible to everyone. And Sweden said that there are herds of black elephants. And he talked about global warming, which we just talked about in Steve's presentation, deforestation, acidification, et cetera. And I'd ask you, is COVID-19 an example of a black elephant? If you doubt that it was the elephant in the room, follow the link here to Event 201, where the Bill Gates Foundation effectively simulated the COVID-19 pandemic in 2019. And it was abundantly clear that this was a massive risk, and we were thoroughly unprepared for it. And my final creature is a butterfly. And I wanted to talk about the butterfly effect. Perhaps in my own life, answering a newspaper ad for an actuary after I graduated from university was a butterfly effect that led me to speaking to you today. But a butterfly effect is effectively a very subtle change in initial conditions that can have large consequences in the future. And it's fundamentally the foundation of chaos theory. And I'll give you some examples. Gore versus Bush, the US election in 2000 was decided by about 500 votes in Florida, where I happened to be working at that time. Had Bush's brother not been the governor of Florida and a few other things gone different, Al Gore would have been president and the world would have been thoroughly different. Archduke Ferdinand's driver made a wrong turn in Sarajevo in 1914 and led events that triggered World War I. And a Soviet missile officer in 1983 saw massive numbers of US missiles on a radar screen, which of course were a false alarm, and he chose not to push the red button. Again, those are just simple examples of random small events that have large consequences. So now I want to talk about some examples of catastrophic complexity. And I always like this quote somewhat maybe applicable these days, where he said that, America's government was designed by geniuses so it could be run by idiots. And he said, no, I was wrong. No system can be smart enough to survive the level of incompetence and recklessness by these people. He did say that in 2008 for the record, so he was not referring to anything occurring currently. But it makes the point that sometimes, and it's the same point that Taleb was making in his writings about fragility, that a well-designed system can help you withstand either extreme risks or incompetent management. So the first few slides, I want to talk about something that I think is a major actuarial failing, and it's our tendency sometimes to take the last 10 years of experience, fit a curve to it, and then model it 10,000 times and think we understand the tail risk because we fit some distribution to it. And that's all well and good, but an alternative way to look at risk is to actually go back and see stuff that really happened in the last 250 years, and then say, what would happen if that same thing happened today? So my first example of that is the Carrington event, and I've called this few slides, "It happened before technology." And this is an example. There was a big solar flare in 1859, so you might have even been able to see the northern lights in places like Vietnam and China. And you could see telegraph systems, catch fire, etc. But there was no real damage. If that same thing happened today, and that actually happened about 150 years ago, if that happened today, you would wipe out the electric grids on half of the Earth and knock out most every satellite in orbit. The losses would be in the trillions, and services might be disrupted for years. If you model extreme risk in our current society, you wouldn't pick this risk up. But this is a clear example of something that could easily happen, because it did, and could result in massive disruption on a scale far bigger than COVID-19. Another one, and those of you in Indonesia who work in this part of the world will understand this one very well, but unfortunately British Airways did not. That in about the last 20 years, a big volcano, which I can never pronounce the name, it's about a 27-letter Icelandic name, erupted in Iceland. Now, volcanoes have been erupting there for thousands of years. People know that, but they hadn't had an eruption during the jet airplane era, and nobody had planned for a volcano eruption, despite the fact it was an obvious risk and it ground air travel to a halt in Europe for a long time. Another example of why didn't they notice that. The third one is Tohoku, the nuclear power plant meltdown in Japan. Here we had an example of, this is a zone that has had tsunamis for all of recorded history. In fact, that's a picture of a tsunami stone that are placed all around Japan to mark the spot where the tsunami waters had come in the past. And many of those stones are inscribed with things saying, for the peace and harmony of your family, do not build below this point. Well, they built a nuclear power plant with a 6-foot-high seawall and didn't waterproof the backup generators. And what happened? A tsunami very similar in magnitude to the one that happened in 1700 wiped it out, melted the power plant down, and caused enormous damage, a completely foreseeable risk. Now I want to turn to another risk management question, which is what I call unmodeled and unaware. I remember I was working in Asia when the Thai floods happened, and I think it was 2010 or 11, and I remember talking to Japanese insurers who were clients of my company, and they could not understand how their enterprise risk management systems just totally missed this risk. And of course, the answer was that there weren't any good Thai flood models at that point in time. And so the modeling didn't show any risk in Thailand, even though there were $2 billion Honda motor plants like the one on the screen, and other massive industrial facilities on the riverfront in Thailand. And that points out the error that just because risk is not modeled does not mean it doesn't exist. And again, the Thai floods are another great example of an obvious risk that we missed because we over-relied on models. I'll turn now to Australian floods. We had a massive flooding event here. again, around the same time as the Thai floods. And what Australia did was they had big floods in the 1970s. They built massive dams all over Queensland. They then said, we don't have any flood risk, so we'll put tens of thousands of houses down and build Brisbane up downriver because we don't have a flood risk anymore. It's safe, it can't happen. They had a drought. Then they wanted to save water, so they filled the dam up, and then they got a couple of tropical cyclones, and the dams overflowed, and billions of dollars of losses occurred where the model said they couldn't. And this illustrates the human factor in risk. You know, how do you model the behavior of dam operators? You know, how would you anticipate that something that couldn't happen was going to happen because some person, I won't use a stronger word, you know, failed to let the water out of the dams. And in Sydney, as we speak, the dams here are at 100%, and we're heading into a La Nina just like before, and we hope they've learned their lesson. And then there's the other thing that kind of Brooks alluded to, which is, you know, when we're warned about risk and we ignore it. So I'll give you two examples. I worked on the first one. Hurricane Pam was an exercise. I used to work in the Gulf Coast. And, you know, there was an exercise that simulated a hurricane making landfall between Louisiana and Mississippi. And this was a press release they put out just sort of describing their simulation, which is said, you know, basically the levees were overtopped in New Orleans, 1 million restaurants evacuated, 600,000 buildings destroyed, blah, blah, blah. 2004. What happened in 2005? Hurricane Katrina did exactly that. And they were utterly unprepared. Another great example is Crimson Contagion. This was an exercise run by the Department of Health and Human Services in the United States in October 2019 that simulated the effect of, I believe it was a coronavirus, and what it would do to the US healthcare systems, et cetera. And it basically predicted COVID-19 almost to the week. They probably did not predict the presidential election and the politicization of masks, but they clearly showed how poorly prepared the United States was for a pandemic. Again, it happened before in 1918 with the Spanish flu. It's happened now. People were unprepared. They failed to learn the lessons of history. There's a Latin phrase that my lawyer brother says, and I think it's a good one here. It's called res ipsa loquitur, which means the thing speaks for itself. And I don't know what more you can do, but look at that slide and shake your head. And I'll conclude with the Beirut blast. That's an example of Brooks's point about becoming acclimated to risk. In this case, there was a boat confiscated because it failed to pay its port fees. They impounded the cargo of 2,500 tons of ammonium nitrate. They put it in a warehouse that was poorly ventilated, that was right next to the national grain elevator that you can see there, which was the national food supply. And guess what? It blew up and leveled the city. And again, you know, how could you miss that risk? So I observed some things from these things. I mean, first of all, these events and many like them illustrate important things about risk management, or perhaps the lack of it. You know, we've got a complex world. There's complex supply chains, and we have risks that are difficult to extrapolate from our models and from recent past events. And a key issue is the collision of natural hazards like that tsunami with modern society like a nuclear power plant. And we often become too comfortable with our model and ignore risk that falls outside the models. And that human factors are very important to think about and very hard to model. However, as we'll see in the next section, we have a remarkable capacity to adjust to risk and mitigate it. So my next section is called Gray Swans. And here I want to walk through past crises like COVID-19 and show that actually systems can adapt and perhaps give you some hope for the future of our current pandemic problems. My first example was when the world went off the gold standard. Up until 1971, there were fixed exchange rates denominated in gold. And so you could, buy things in French francs, and you could sell them in US dollars, and you could basically not worry about exchange rate risk. And in 1971, countries abandoned the gold standard and allowed exchange rates to float. And firms all over the world experienced massive financial problems. An example was Laker Airways, which basically bought jet fuel in US dollars and sold tickets in UK pounds. Of course, the tickets were often sold 6 months before the flight, and the jet fuel was purchased the day of the flight. So the exchange rate risk wreaked havoc with companies like that. But as a result of that crisis, new tools emerged like exchange hedging, the foundations of enterprise risk management, currency options, derivative markets, and all these new risk management things evolved to handle this. My next example is the 1970s oil crisis and inflation. There were two massive oil spikes in the 1970s, right after the exchange rates were freed. I personally remember I had a car that had the biggest engine the US automakers ever made, and it got about 4 miles a gallon. And the price of petrol went from about 23 cents a gallon to 70 cents, and I just about went broke before I entered uni. So I got a lesson in economics from that I've never forgotten. And this led to problems with mismatched assets and liabilities. You had firms that had assets of 30-year bonds at 2%, and they were paying claims that were inflating at 20%. And that created all kinds of havoc in the financial system. But again, that led to monetary policy, inflation-linked bonds, asset liability matching, which we all do today. And again, another fraud for ERM. And I ask you this, have lessons of this era been forgotten? Governments today are printing money like drunken sailors. And it's hard for me to believe that all this money that's being created today is not going to lead to inflation tomorrow. But very few of you in the audience have probably lived through a bout of inflation. Hurricane Andrew was an example that, there have been hurricanes hitting Florida forever, just like the Iceland volcanoes. But in 1992, when I happened to be working in Florida when this happened, a massive cyclone hit South Florida, basically in the same place as cyclone hit there in 1926. The difference is that in 1926, there were a few 100,000 people there. In 1992, there were millions of people there and millions of homes. Andrew destroyed not only the housing environment, but the insurance market. And there were massive risk control failures. Actuaries were pricing products based on the last 20 or 30 years of history that did not include extreme events. And cheap insurance led to overdevelopment and poor building practice, just like cheap petrol led me to buy a car with an enormous engine I couldn't afford to drive. Another lesson in economics. But again, after Andrew, we saw government actions, new regulatory structures, a government reinsurer, the Florida Cat Fund, stronger building codes, all kinds of regulatory changes. Insurers began to use catastrophe models. There were new Bermuda reinsurers founded, new pricing techniques. And this led to a recovery in the insurance market such that when a similar thing happened in 2004, the market survived extremely well. The World Trade Center, 9/11. We all know that terrible day when those demented people crashed those planes into buildings in the United States. And at the time, I remember I was in the Florida Capitol outside of Governor Bush's office when those planes hit. And I remember thinking, we would never again see terrorism insurance offered in the United States or the world. But after the event, it woke up the government. We had the war on terror, airport security screenings. I remember not only when you could smoke a pack of cigarettes on a flight, but you could also walk onto the plane without going through a metal detector. And, hard to imagine those days today, but infrastructure was hardened. Security was invested in. Risk pools like TRIA or ARPC here in Australia, Pool Re in the UK were formed. And insurers built models, changed policy wordings. led to new pricing techniques. And after that, we've now had a significant recovery of the terrorism reinsurance market. In fact, the Australian terrorism pool is able to purchase a huge amount of retro cover for their terrorism pool here in the global market. Probably one of my last examples is the global financial crisis. That was what Mr. Friedman was referring to when he said that, you know, the idiots were in charge of what the geniuses designed. But we had toxic financial instruments, banks taking extreme risk, housing bubbles, bad regulation. But after that, there was an overhaul of financial regulation. The Basel framework was put in. We had better contingent capital requirements, capital reporting requirements, et cetera. And we largely learned our lessons and enacted a lot of things that have really strengthened the financial system. But I'd ask you today, there are these new things that the same geniuses have cooked up called collateralized loan obligations. And if you want to scare yourself, don't think about climate, Google the word CLO and see what comes up. And you'll see the next CDO lurking out there right now as we speak. So, lessons from the past. What do we learn from all this stuff? Well, there's many examples of events like this, but most or all of these examples contain elements of the black swans, black elephants, butterflies, and catastrophic complexity that I described in the early part of this talk. And in each case, the situation looked dire at the time, but new institutions and tools emerged to manage risk. And I think there's a lot of lessons in this stuff for the COVID pandemic we're currently in. I mean, first of all, risk is understood through a combination of models and mindset. You've got to not only model stuff, but you have to analyze psychology and think about how humans are going to react to things. And and understand that you've got to blend these two things together, and you can't just model your way out of trouble. Secondly, complex systems are full of interconnected risks. As we learned in Thailand, when we had those floods, there were motor assembly plants in Thailand that were underwater, and factories in the United States didn't have engines to assemble the cars with. Human psychology is a key factor, and it's a challenge to model that. But risk mitigation and adaptation can transform seemingly impossible problems and make them solvable. And many risks are global, and that ties back to Steve's comments on climate, that neither viruses nor carbon, for example, respect borders and require global solutions. I did want to throw in one final thought, because it sounds here like I'm saying there's all these calamities and we never get it right, and we're just incompetent at assessing risk, and that's not true. Y2K, that was foreseen, and we all thought that that was going to create massive trouble. When we think about climate risk, we get pessimistic when we see what's going on. But in I think it was 1992, the Montreal Protocol banned chlorofluorocarbons and saved the ozone layer. And that was a great example of countries coming together and seeing a problem and solving it. And I've listed a whole lot of other things up there that have largely been mitigated or risk managed. And so I think there are a lot of examples that show that this can be done, but our challenge is to reduce the stuff I talked about earlier, like the Hoku and the air traffic problem, that are obvious and foreseeable risks, and have more success stories like this. And the key question is, how do we do that? So my last section is called Evolving the Risk Management Paradigm. And this is a quote, I won't read it, but this is Secretary Rumsfeld's famous known unknowns and unknown unknowns quote, which you can read for yourself. But to me, the challenge we face as risk managers is to have less and less unknown unknowns, the black swans that come up and surprise us and end up with disastrous consequences like COVID-19, and move them down the ladder towards known unknowns and maybe even known knowns, so that we can reduce the consequences of these things that keep happening to us. You can't read this on the screen. It's intended for you to see if you download the presentation and click the link. But I want to close with two two examples of what I think we need to do to overcome some of these problems. The first, I really liked this article by McKinsey, and it talked about 6 problem-solving mindsets. And their contention was that you had to adopt a problem-solving mindset in order to deal with uncertainty. And that required, going back to Brooks at the beginning, a change in how people think about risk and understanding human psychology. And their 6 things were: first, be ever curious, as curiosity is the engine of creativity. Second, you have to be able to tolerate ambiguity and stay humble. You can't always assume you know the answer. You've got to embrace the fact that you don't know the answer most of the time and be afraid to say that. Not unafraid to say that, excuse me. They talk about a dragonfly eye view, which is something they say is used by great problem solvers. And they say to think of this as widening the aperture of a problem or viewing it through multiple lenses. Dragonflies can see at many different types of light, apparently ultraviolet and various other color spectrums. And it lets them see things in different ways. And then they can use that to avoid risk and find their prey. The next one is they talk about a current behavior, which is actually working off of what actually happens in a time and place, not what you thought was going to happen. So it's basically not allowing your models to lead you to believe something is not going on and miss it, as was the case with the Deepwater Horizon, where they basically thought the blowout preventer was going to eliminate risk, and they ignored the evidence before their eyes of the thing failing. The next thing, number 5, they say tap into collective intelligence and the wisdom of the crowd. Crowdsourcing works. Sometimes you get a much better answer by asking 100 people a question than asking one expert. And finally, they say show and tell to drive action. And what they mean by that is that if all you can do is get in front of a group of people and tell them about your actuarial models and a bunch of complicated math, sometimes you're not going to get people to listen to you. And you've got to use analogy, storytelling. Some of the techniques I've tried to use in this presentation, where I've tried to tell a story and do it in a way, hopefully, that everybody can understand. And they conclude this article by saying the mindsets of great problem solvers are just as important as the methods they employ. My other 2 authors, the last 2 I want to introduce you to, are 2 really good guys, and they've got one of my favorite quotes on the next slide. And they just put out an article talking about how to predict crises. And their context was national security and international relations, but they make some really good points in this article, and I highly commend it. And they kind of talk about global relations, and they say, when it comes to anticipating the future, the US gets the worst of both worlds. It spends untold sums of money preparing for perhaps fighting World War II over again with aircraft carriers, and then finds itself the victim of surprise, ill-equipped for things like COVID-19. If we had taken what we spend on one aircraft carrier and invested it in COVID-19 preparation, we might not be in lockdown right now in some parts of the world. What these guys are saying in this article, and again, I can't do it justice in the 2 minutes I have to talk about it, but they did have this phrase here called dart tossing chimpanzees, which he basically did a study, one of the authors, and showed that all the experts in the economics field had trouble outperforming random number generators when it came to predicting events. And I think maybe we could replace random number generators with dart tossing chimpanzees. If you remember nothing else from this talk, you might have learned a new phrase. They also talk about the problems of what they call hedgehogs and foxes. And they say that the hedgehogs are people who are always sure of what they know, but they often fare the worst. And often people who are a little more unsure of what they know are the best predictors. And they also talk about a technique, and I find this really interesting, to instead of asking an expert something like, will China be the dominant power in 2050, or will we achieve net zero, or big questions like that, They said instead what you want to do is break down those sort of questions about the future into clear and forecastable things. So for example, instead of saying, will we get to net zero in 2050, they might say, will the European Union put carbon taxes on trading partners by 2025? Or will there be 10,000 charging stations across Singapore by 2030? Or will there be a move towards green aluminum for iPhones? And answer those specific questions. They call them question clusters, which are diverse, and then be able to use those answers to understand big picture questions like, will we achieve net zero? And they also talk about the importance of drawing upon groups of experts instead of individuals, repeating the insight McKinsey had. And their last point gets back to something I was alluding to earlier, which is they say you've got to blend scenario analysis and probabilistic forecasts. You've got to basically look at things like scenarios that complement your models. So an example of that might be if we were looking at the extreme risk from, say, big trillion, million, multi-billion dollar events, maybe you need to put in a scenario like where the dam operators overfill the dam in Australia and allow it to overflow, thus causing a flood that your model said cannot happen. And you will get better forecasts if you do that. So my final slide is a series of closing thoughts on managing risk. First, there's no way we can anticipate what's going to happen decades in the future. So we need to focus on system design for resilience and adaptability. And that's the point that Taleb and Traverton were making in the Arab Spring article. And in order to build resilience, you need two psychological traits. You need opposability. That means you can hold conflicting ideas in one mind and be open to new ideas. And adaptability. I always tell my actuarial students, my favorite words you speak are "I was wrong." I like to hear those words because it means you learned something. Or, I've changed my mind. Those are the words that are spoken by smart people. Study history. I gave you a whole lot of examples of how new technology is affecting stuff that happened in the past. You can learn a lot by reading a history book and asking yourself the question, what would happen if that happened today? Think stochastically. As actuaries, we live in a world of trying to quantify and manage uncertainty. And instead of saying, we either are, climate environmentalists or we're skeptics, the answer is it's not black and white, it's shades of gray. And you need to think about probabilities instead of certainties. From Brooks, we learned that we need to develop new skills to deal with catastrophic complexity and human psychology. From Taleb and Traverton, we understood about volatility and stability and fragility. From McKinsey, we thought we learned to adopt problem-solving mindsets and their 6 approaches. And from Skoblik and Tetlock, aside from dart-tossing chimpanzees, they talk about using clusters of sharply defined questions in order to help you understand the future. That's the conclusion of my talk. Thank you very much for your time. I hope you found something of interest there. And I would be pleased to answer any questions you may have. If you want to contact me, there's my email address, and OzGator, that's for an Australian Florida gator. That's a website I've got with some of my papers and other information on it if you are interested. Thank you.
Thank you, Rade. That was definitely a wake-up call in terms of being more aware of risks and risk management. That just because they're unmodeled doesn't mean that it isn't there, or that we shouldn't be the epitome of like ignoring signs. Definitely, it would take courage for us to say, I was wrong. And as humans, we tend to shy away from uncertainty, though we are in the very industry that tries to manage it, such. So, well, there's a question from the audience. Given that you have worked in Asia for a number of years. Do you have thoughts on what are the gray swans or the black elephants for Asia? And actually, how do you sleep at night with all these?
I sleep quite well, actually. It's I mean, I don't let this stuff scare me. I let it challenge me. It gives me something to think about. When I'm bored riding my exercise bike or going to the gym. In terms of Asia, to me, there's several things. Antibiotic resistant bugs are one that would scare me.